They call it a breakthrough, Africa solving African problems at African prices. A $1 billion deal, a pipeline stretching 2,000 kilometers from the Atlantic coast to landlocked Zimbabwe. Promises cheaper fuel and thousands of jobs. On every television screen it looks like a clean victory, a feel-good story that finally does not have a Western or Chinese logo stamped on it. For a continent tired of begging for loans and listening to lectures, this feels like justice arriving in steel. But power never travels alone. Behind the smiling photos in Harare, one man now sits at the center of a new energy web that runs from the Dangote refinery in Lagos, to storage tanks in Walvis Bay, all the way to Bulawayo where factories have been dying in the dark. When one private empire controls the tap, what happens when he decides to turn the pressure up or down? Is this the moment Africa breaks free from foreign control, or the birth of an African-owned monopoly that nobody voted for? If this is the kind of story they do not want you to see, leave a like so more people can find it. On November 12, 2025, Zimbabwe's government signed a $1 billion infrastructure deal with Aliko Dangote in Harare. At its core is a 2,000-kilometer fuel pipeline from the deep-water port of Walvis Bay in Namibia, cutting through Botswana and ending in Bulawayo, all tied back to the giant Dangote refinery in Lagos. For a country suffering blackouts of up to 18 hours a day as the Kariba Dam dries up, this is not a prestige project. Zimbabwe is losing around 6.1% of its gross domestic product every year because factories stop. Mines pause and small businesses cannot keep the lights on. On paper, the pipeline looks like salvation. But the way it is financed, built and controlled is where the real story begins. To understand why this $1 billion pipe matters, you have to start in the dark. In Harare, Bulawayo, Gweru, whole neighborhoods vanish into blackness for most of the day. Grocery stores rush to close before sunset because their fridges cannot be trusted to stay cold. Parents put their children to bed under the yellow glow of candles, not because they are romantic, but because the grid has collapsed into a lottery. You do not know when the lights will go off. You only know that they will. For Zimbabwean businesses, this is not an inconvenience. It is slow suffocation. A small welding shop cannot afford a generator big enough to run all its equipment, so the owner chooses between lighting and machinery. A maize mill spends more on diesel than on salaries. A gold mine that should be running 3 shifts a day cuts back to 1, not because the gold is gone, but because there is not enough power to crush and process the ore. When economists say Zimbabwe is losing over 6% of its GDP to power cuts, that is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is factories standing silent, trucks parked in dusty lots, workers sent home early with half a pay envelope. All of this is happening in a country already strangled by geography. Zimbabwe has no coastline. Every liter of fuel must cross one border, often several, before it reaches a pump. For years, Harare has relied on routes through South Africa and Mozambique, where port fees, trucking costs and political friction all stack up. A supply disruption in Durban, a strike in Maputo, a currency crisis anywhere along the chain, every shock arrives at the pump. Fuel becomes more expensive, everything that depends on fuel becomes more expensive, and a fragile household budget snaps. Against this backdrop, a 2,000-kilometer pipeline is not just steel. It is oxygen. From Walvis Bay on the Atlantic coast, through Botswana into Bulawayo, the proposed route promises to bypass the most fragile links in Zimbabwe's logistics chain. Instead of buying refined products from layers of middlemen, the country would be connected directly to one of the biggest refineries in the world, the Dangote refinery in Lagos. On the surface, this looks like genius. A landlocked economy ties itself to an African-built, African-owned industrial giant, cutting out global majors who have profited from these bottlenecks for decades. To understand how we got here, you have to rewind to Lagos. When Aliko Dangote set out to build his refinery, he went shopping for expertise. Western and Asian engineering giants lined up with proposals and glossy feasibility studies. The price tags were breathtaking, tens of billions of dollars, complex financing, and conditions that would have left foreign firms with deep control. The unspoken message was clear: you Africans cannot build something like this on your own. Pay us, and we will do it for you, on our terms. Dangote refused that script. Instead of handing over control, he assembled his own network: African engineers, local contractors, regional suppliers. He broke the mega-project into packages, rejected the most inflated offers, and pushed for African prices. The final cost was still enormous, but a fraction of what some international players had suggested. That refinery is now the beating heart of his empire, a structure that says, in steel and concrete, that Africa does not have to outsource its industrial ambition. So when he looks at Zimbabwe, he does not just see a country in crisis. He sees a captive market at the end of a route he can design. He knows how expensive Western and Chinese contractors can make these projects, because he has seen their quotes. He also knows how much cheaper they become when Africans control the build, the logistics and the financing. If you connect a country that is suffocating for lack of fuel to a refinery you own, using a pipeline you control, you are not just solving a problem. You are locking in a relationship. This is not his first dance with Zimbabwe. In 2015, when Robert Mugabe was still in power, Africa's richest man flew into Harare with big promises: a power plant, cement investments, $1 billion for a country already under heavy sanctions and isolation. The meetings were warm. The photos were taken, and then he walked away. Officially, the climate was too difficult. Unofficially, his team heard about mediation fees and gatekeepers who wanted to be paid just to let the money in. In simple language, corruption taxes on top of political risk. Fast forward a decade. Mugabe is gone. Emerson Mnangagwa sits in State House, declaring Zimbabwe open for business. The economy is still battered, sanctions still bite, but the language has changed. Harare is desperate for investment that looks African, not colonial. Dangote, meanwhile, is no longer just a cement king. He is the architect of the largest single-train refinery in the world. His leverage is different. The same man who once called Zimbabwe too messy now returns on stronger terms, not as a suitor begging for access, but as a power broker offering salvation. If you are still here listening, you are already part of a small group trying to follow the real mechanics behind the headlines, not just the feel-good slogans. That matters. When you like or comment, you are not only helping this channel, you are telling the algorithm that Africans care about who builds what, who owns what, and who really benefits. That is how conversations like this stop being whispers and start becoming pressure. There is also the brutal logic of geography on Dangote's side. For Western investors, Zimbabwe is a nightmare, landlocked, politically risky, often at war with its own currency. For a regional player building a network, those same weaknesses look like leverage. If you solve the fuel problem for a country with no port, you gain enormous influence. If your pipeline becomes the cheapest, most reliable artery feeding its economy, anyone who wants to challenge you must either build a parallel route at huge cost or accept that. Like it or not, you are the one holding the wrench. This is the strategic genius of the Walvis Bay, Botswana, Bulawayo route. It does not just plug Zimbabwe into the Atlantic. It stitches three countries into shared dependence on the same infrastructure, tied back to the same private empire. Namibia becomes the storage hub, Botswana the corridor, Zimbabwe the end market, and Lagos the command center. On a map, it looks like efficiency. On a balance sheet, it looks like profit. On a geopolitical chessboard, it looks like power. Up to now we have been talking about Zimbabwe's desperation and Dangote's opportunity. But this pipeline is not just a story of a country that needs power and a billionaire who can provide it. It is the blueprint of a new power network being sketched across Africa, where private empires, ruling parties and foreign players are all trying to plug themselves into the same pipe. Start with Dangote. For years, Western media sold him as a feel-good symbol, the African billionaire who built a fortune on cement instead of tech or oil, proof that you could succeed here without being a foreign corporation. But cement was only rehearsal. Energy is the real show. Cement plants are heavy and local. Fuel flows. It crosses borders, touches every factory, every bus, every household bill. Whoever sits at the center of that flow does not just earn profits, they quietly set the rhythm of entire economies. The Lagos refinery is the heart of this system. Walvis Bay becomes one storage lung. The Zimbabwe pipeline is a new artery. On the old map, such lines usually led back to names like Total, Shell or Sinopec. On this map, one of the biggest names is Dangote. From his perspective, this is simply smart African capitalism: build infrastructure others desperately need but cannot finance or manage, keep costs far below what Western and Chinese contractors would charge. Use the margin to grow faster and invest in the next link of the chain. No lectures, no IMF mission, just contracts and concrete. On the other side of those contracts is a very fragile state. Zimbabwe is still ruled by ZANU-PF, a party that earned its legitimacy in the Liberation War but then spent decades building a dense web of patronage, military influence and business cartels. Under Mugabe, ideology and corruption blended together. Under Mnangagwa, the slogans changed: Zimbabwe is open for business, but many of the networks underneath are still there. When the president says, open, the uncomfortable question is, open for whom? Look closely at the signing ceremony in Harare. The president is there. Ministers are there. Dangote is front and center. But key power figures like Vice President Constantino Chiwenga are absent. Maybe it is scheduling. Maybe it is a signal that not every faction inside the ruling elite feels equally committed to this project. Or to who will benefit from it. In countries like Zimbabwe, megaprojects are rarely neutral. They decide which clique inside the party gets contracts, kickbacks, and visibility, and which clique is pushed to the margins. Around the fuel sector, an older ecosystem already exists: importers, wholesalers, trucking companies, politically connected businessmen who have profited for years from the very bottlenecks this pipeline now promises to remove. A direct line to Dangote's refinery threatens many of those models. Some players will be bought into the new arrangement. Others will be cut off and quietly resist. That behind-the-scenes struggle helps explain why government messaging is triumphalist but information about the actual terms of the deal is thin. Then there are the actors who used to dominate this game from outside. For Western engineering giants and oil majors, a corridor like Walvis Bay, Botswana, Bulawayo would once have been an obvious candidate for a multi-billion-dollar package: expensive construction contracts, complex financing, long-term supply agreements. Now they watch an African-led consortium claim a deal whose total value is closer to $1 billion, and they understand what it means, if this model works. Similar projects in Zambia, Malawi, or Uganda may no longer need them in the same way. China is watching too. Beijing spent the last 2 decades selling itself as the new infrastructure partner for the Global South: ports, roads, power plants built with Chinese money, Chinese firms, Chinese labor. The formula was simple: we build, you owe. The Zimbabwe deal breaks that narrative. The capital, the engineering and the political leverage are overwhelmingly African. But from a geopolitical angle, the pattern is still familiar: a growing dependency on a single powerful actor, just not one headquartered in Washington or Beijing. That tension sits at the heart of this story. On the surface, the pipeline looks like decolonization in steel: no World Bank conditionalities, no IMF austerity packages, no Western donors treating Harare like a misbehaving student. Instead, Africans do business with Africans, on terms negotiated in African capitals. It feels like sovereignty. It feels like dignity. But sovereignty is not only about who signs the contract. It is also about who can challenge it, who can revise it, and who can walk away if it becomes abusive. What happens if, 10 years from now, a different government in Harare decides the tariffs or profit sharing are unfair and wants to renegotiate? If Zimbabwe's entire fuel lifeline runs through a pipeline it does not control, into a refinery it does not own, its leverage will be limited. In theory there are regulators and courts. In practice, in many African states, institutions are weak, politically influenced, and easily bypassed in the name of investor confidence. This is why transparency is not a luxury, it is the only safeguard ordinary people have. Yet the key questions remain unanswered in public. Who owns what share of the pipeline over its lifetime? What guarantees has the Zimbabwean state offered? How will prices be set? How will communities along the route be compensated and protected? These are matters that parliaments and citizens should debate in the open. Because once the pipe is buried, the choices it represents are buried with it. And still, it would be simplistic to paint Dangote as just another colonizer with darker skin. In a world where Western capital is increasingly used as a weapon, and Chinese capital comes with its own strings, large-scale African capital is both a risk and a necessity. Without it, countries like Zimbabwe stay trapped between begging and decay. With it, they gain a third option, but one that can easily slide from liberation into a new kind of empire if nobody is watching. That is why this pipeline matters far beyond Zimbabwe's borders. It is a prototype. Today it links one landlocked nation to one billionaire's refinery. Tomorrow, variations of this model could wire half the continent. The issue is not whether Africa should build these arteries, it must. The issue is whether the power they create will be shared outward, or concentrated ever tighter in a few unaccountable hands. What is being tested in Zimbabwe is bigger than Zimbabwe. It is a template. If a $1 billion African-led project can deliver what foreign companies used to price at $15 billion, every finance minister from Lusaka to Kampala is going to take notice. Landlocked economies across the continent have the same headache: expensive fuel, fragile supply routes, and a constant dependence on somebody else's port, somebody else's politics, somebody else's currency. Look at a map. Zambia, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, South Sudan, Niger, Chad, each one sits inland. Each one talks about industrialization, and each one quietly bleeds money because moving fuel and raw materials in and out is so costly. For years, the answer was always the same: wait for a Western or Chinese consortium. Accept their price, sign their conditions, and then spend the next 30 years paying back loans denominated in a foreign currency you do not control. What Zimbabwe and Dangote are doing hints at a different route: African capital, African engineering, African pricing. If this model spreads, by 2030 you could imagine a web of African-built arteries, one corridor running from Angolan ports into the Copperbelt, another from Dar es Salaam into Rwanda and eastern Congo, another from Ghana's coast deep into the Sahel. Some would move fuel, some would carry power, some might be rail for minerals and food. On paper, it looks like liberation, a continent finally stitching itself together on its own terms, instead of being tied into routes designed around colonial extraction. For the old order, that is a threat. Western oil majors and engineering firms lose contracts. Development banks lose some of their leverage. China loses its monopoly on the role of builder-in-chief for the global south. But for ordinary Africans, it is not about bruised egos in London or Beijing. It is about whether their factories can run, whether buses are affordable, whether food prices stabilize. If African-led projects can really deliver infrastructure at a fraction of the old cost, that should be good news. The risk is not in the idea of African capital. The risk is in who wields it, and how accountable they are. A network of Dangote-style projects could either become the backbone of a more sovereign continent, or the skeleton of a private empire stretching across borders with very little oversight. A pipeline here, a power station there, a strategic port concession somewhere else, link enough of them together and you have an influence map that does not need an army or a flag. You just need the ability to turn things on and off. And remember, this conversation does not only belong to the people physically living on the continent. Millions of Africans in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, South Africa and the Gulf send money home every month. They pay for school fees, hospital bills, funerals, building projects. They do not get to vote on how pipelines are financed or who controls them. But they feel the consequences when fuel prices spike and currencies crash. In a very real sense, the diaspora is subsidizing the gaps left by broken infrastructure and bad deals. That is why your attention matters. If you are in New York, London or Johannesburg watching this on a phone, you are part of the political economy of these decisions whether you like it or not. You may never stand at a filling station in Harare, but your remittances will be stretched or relieved depending on whether deals like this one are structured fairly. If you believe Africa should be able to build at African prices, with African hands, and under rules that protect ordinary people, then say so, in the comments, with a like, by sharing this. That is how we tell the algorithm this is not just energy news. It is about power in the deepest sense. Because in the end, infrastructure is not neutral. A road can be used to move food or troops. A port can welcome trade or smuggle resources out. A pipeline can bring cheap fuel or become a choke point in a crisis. If Africa is going to wire itself together through privately led mega projects, then Africans, at home and abroad, have to insist on two things at the same time: yes to African solutions, and no to being locked into new forms of dependency with no exit. Imagine two futures. In the first, countries like Zimbabwe use the breathing space from cheaper, more reliable energy to fix deeper structural problems. They reform their currencies, invest in local manufacturing, move up the value chain in minerals and agriculture, and strengthen institutions so that no single company, no matter how powerful, can capture the state. In that timeline, pipelines and refineries are tools of sovereignty. In the second future, governments take the easy win: fewer blackouts, more headlines, but never change the fundamentals. They keep exporting raw materials, keep suffocating local industry, keep running down their currencies. In that world, a network of African-owned infrastructure simply becomes a more efficient way to move unprocessed wealth out of the continent, while ordinary people remain stuck at the bottom of the value chain. The logos on the pipes may be African, but the logic is the same old story. Right now, standing in 2025, nobody can say for sure which path Zimbabwe, or Africa, will take. What we can say is that deals like this pipeline are not side notes. They are forks in the road. The choice is not between foreign domination and a perfect African utopia. The real choice is whether Africans will shape this new era of infrastructure as citizens with a voice, or accept it as customers trapped inside someone else's monopoly. And that is the question we have to carry with us before we even talk about the twist in this story. Here is the twist in this whole story: the biggest danger in this deal is not that Zimbabwe is working with Dangote. It is that Zimbabwe might waste the very window of opportunity this pipeline opens. On paper, a cheaper and more reliable fuel supply looks like a simple technical fix. In reality, it is a political weapon and a clock, both at the same time. For the next 10 or 15 years. If this project works as advertised, Zimbabwe will finally be able to breathe a little. Fewer blackouts. Less diesel burned in noisy generators. Lower transport costs. That breathing space can be used in two completely different ways. In one version of the future, the state treats this pipeline as a shock absorber while it fixes deeper problems. It uses the savings from reduced power losses and fuel inefficiencies to rebuild the grid. Invest in generation, support local manufacturing, reform the currency, and climb up the value chain in mining and agriculture. Cheap, stable energy becomes the foundation for something more: factories that export finished products instead of raw minerals. Small businesses that can plan beyond next month, a workforce trained to do more than just dig and drive. In the other version, the government does what is easiest: it enjoys the short-term relief and never touches the hard questions. It keeps exporting raw commodities, keeps neglecting local industry, keeps tolerating corruption in the state and the party. Cheaper fuel becomes a kind of anesthesia. People feel a little better. The worst pain is dulled. But the disease, a broken political economy, is left untouched. When the world changes again, when prices shift or new shocks come, Zimbabwe finds itself still dependent. Just on a different supplier. This is what African face, same dependency really means. If the contracts are opaque, if the regulators are weak, if the public has no real access to information, then it does not matter that the logo on the pipeline is African. The logic of power is identical, one actor holds the lever, and everyone else adjusts. In a crisis, over prices, over politics, over foreign pressure, it takes only one decision higher up the chain to slow flows, to raise tariffs, to squeeze a government into line. You do not need troops or tanks when you control the tap that keeps the economy alive. That is why this pipeline cannot just be celebrated as a bargain. $15 billion worth of infrastructure for $1 billion sounds heroic, but the real price tag will be written over time in what Zimbabwe does, or fails to do, with the advantage it gains. If it builds resilience, diversifying energy sources, strengthening institutions, creating room for other players in the market, then this deal will look, in hindsight, like a turning point. If it simply locks the country into a single corridor and a single supplier, then the story will be much darker, a country that escaped foreign tutelage only to drift into a private empire it cannot vote out. Infrastructure is often described as neutral, as if pipes do not care who they serve. But this pipe is a political statement. It says, we choose to tie our future to this route. This refinery, this set of hands. Nobody held a referendum on that choice. Most Zimbabweans did not see the contract. Yet their lives will be shaped by it in ways more intimate than any election campaign. That is the twist. The question is no longer whether Africa can build big projects with its own capital. The question is whether it can turn those projects into real sovereignty, or whether they will become steel cages. Built by Africans, locked from the outside and the inside at the same time. Somewhere in Zimbabwe tonight, a generator that used to roar until midnight is finally silent. A nurse can hear her own footsteps in the hospital corridor instead of the constant hum of diesel. A welder locks up his shop knowing he will not lose tomorrow's income to a random blackout. A taxi driver counts his earnings and realizes he has spent less on fuel than the week before. For them, this is not theory. It is the difference between scraping by and standing up a little straighter. That is why this moment matters. This pipeline can be irrigation or a flood. It can water the roots of a more sovereign Africa, or sweep its choices into the hands of a few private empires. The steel does not decide that. Logos do not decide that. People do. If you believe Africans, on the continent and in the diaspora, deserve to shape these decisions as citizens, not just endure them as customers, then stay here with us. Like this video. Leave a comment, subscribe and share it to someone who still thinks these stories are only about infrastructure. We are building a community that reads the fine print, connects the dots, and refuses to let our future be designed in rooms where we are not invited.